instincts told me to run the other way. I was frozen, and before my eyes, the rest of the body snapped and popped as it was transforming into the coyote on all fours. I ran in the direction of my uncle's house. I heard it coming for me as I ran. This is where something weird happened. As it got close this time, my mind went blank. I don't know how to explain this, but I'll do my best. I saw a gray wolf in my mind's eye, and I turned, realizing a growl from my mouth that even sounded like a wolf's growl. The thing stopped, cocked its head to the side, and just stared at me. The thing looked like a coyote, but it was standing on its hind legs. I started walking backwards, seeing the gray wolf, and knowing I was using my instincts at the moment, that if I turned to run, it would cease to chase me down and get me. I kept my eyes on it until I was almost to my uncle's door, where I regained control of my mind. Going into the house, I heard scratching on the door, asking in different voices to be let in for an hour. Then it left. It did come back the next night to my uncle's house, but Tom knew what it was after. Looking at it through the window of the front door, it pretended to be human again, but tried to use my voice to get Tom to open the door. He went straight to work, burning sage and other herbs. Afterwards, asking me if I was the only one it was after. I told him everything. He was mad, telling me, "You're safe for the night, but I'm sending you home in the morning." I know he was mad, but I needed to know what this was. He told me it was a skinwalker, and it was going to hunt me until it loses my scent. He told me about the legend of them, but the wolf thing, he smiled and said that, "You'll have to figure that one out for yourself." The next day, I was picked up by my mom. I'm afraid to go back that way. I don't walk at night anymore, and I still have no answer about the wolf thing that stalked through my mind that night. I was heading to a small town in southern Utah with my wife and a couple of friends. We were on our way to see Lee, and the only thing that I wish for you is for you to forget about what happened, no matter how hard or impossible the idea may seem to you at this time. No, it's not worth it. Trust me on this one. If you try to figure things out on your own, not that I'm saying that there are things that need figuring out, mind you, you'll keep on spiraling down an endless rabbit hole. It's not worth it. What happened to you could have happened to anyone else. You just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not about you, and it has nothing to do with you. That much I can assure you. But you best be certain that we'll take care of it. It's what we do. When I asked him if he had ever seen or heard similar reports of what I had described, he made a little grimace, clearly trying to fight off the urge to tell me more than he should. He had waved his hand, declining to answer, but knowing as well as I did that he had answered me in the process. Finally, when I asked him if I could leave my contact number for him to call me at a later time, maybe once the issue was resolved, and he could tell me about it, his response was very swift and pointless to contest. "No, I'm sorry, but no. You've done more than enough. In fact, you've helped us out tremendously. Thank you for your time." Afterwards, they drove us all the way out of the area and dropped us near the city, from where we eventually made our way back home. It's been a little weird ever since, with my boyfriend not wanting to discuss these events, as if he's pretending that nothing happened at all. I can't tell if this whole thing just scared him to his core, or if there's something more to it. Either way, it helps being back in the city and being surrounded by all of this noise and people, but I don't know what's next for me. Part of me wants to follow the officer's advice. I'll admit that I'm still as curious as ever, cautiously so, but I know the man was not only speaking truthfully, but from experience as well. I really want to let it go, because that's probably for the best, but it's not that easy, especially with the internet at your disposal, just a couple of swipes away, and a whole world of information and people out there, ready to share their stories and knowledge with you. This incident might have put my boyfriend off from camping for a little while, maybe permanently for all I know, but I can't say the same for me, I think. Maybe someday I'll go back, on my own. I really don't know why I would, but that's just the me talking right now. Who knows? In time, I might just find a good enough reason. I'm a private guard in a European country. My job is mainly at night, as I usually patrol the streets with my car. Here, the law about guns are quite restricted compared to the US. Our job is to prevent and report crimes to the actual police. We carry guns, but in fact we can't use them, as they are a mere dissuader to hostile subjects. My nights are made of me driving around, checking the outside of commercial buildings and answering alarms when needed. Usually in isolated places where cars don't usually pass by. My area is quite cold and humid, and it is not uncommon during the winter nights that a strong fog covers the streets, buildings, and entire villages, like in Silent Hill. A fog that would make you think everything is possible in those dark, isolated places. Road to reach one of the last clients, a warehouse for I don't know what kind of stuff. It was a secondary road running in the fields, nothing but grass and bushes on the sides of the street. As usual this time of year, the strong fog didn't let me see the road in front of me for more than several feet. Slowly, I was driving to the building, nothing but fog and the distant light of the warehouse in front of me. I was tired. The last coffee I had was consumed more than 2 hours before, and staying focused wasn't easy. Suddenly, a figure just a bit smaller than a human being crossed the road in front of me. The fog didn't let me see details. It was very fast, running like a dog, but for sure that unnatural pose and dimensions weren't like any animal I'd ever seen in my career. And I've seen deer, cats, once even a small bear crossing my path. Nothing like that, something vaguely similar to a human. I stopped the car immediately. I didn't know what I saw, but it for sure wasn't normal. My job was to repeat irregular detail during the patrol, but what should I say to the station? I saw something for a few seconds in front of my car's light? Really? Something very vivid, but that could be influenced by my tired brain? They probably would laugh at me in the best case scenario. Suggest me to stop drinking on the job in the worst. I decided to go on and reached the isolated building. As always, I left my car open, took my flashlight out with me in the shadows. I recognized with my hand the correct key to put in the gate of the building, and started my search. I didn't turn on the light inside the car. I know every part of it, just by memory. I made my patrol by foot around the warehouse, checked every door, and after almost 5 minutes, I got in my car. I put away the key without using the light. I got on the road again, same fog, but this time, nothing unusual on the road. The air in the car was oddly cold. The heater was pumping warm air in the vehicle, and the windows were closed. But I really couldn't understand why it was that cold. And then a noise seemed to come from the car. I've never been a mechanic guy. I don't understand anything about cars or engines. I just drive them. But that noise didn't sound like anything I've ever heard from a car before. Like a slow, not too heavy scratching. The car seemed to drive just fine, so I would just report the problem once I finished my shift. After 5 minutes of this, I got a call from my colleague. An alarm went off near my position, so he asked if I could check it out. Lately, that alarm went off every night. As a technical problem, so it wasn't anything serious. I arrived to the place a bit later, left my car running outside, and checked inside the building. Everything was normal, as usual, just the alarm going crazy. I got in the car, finally ready to finish my shift. The strange noise finally stopped. No need to report the problem. I arrived at the station where I worked, and found my colleague waiting for me outside to get in the car and start his shift. I took my stuff and got out of the car. He got in and turned on the light to search for something. I was already walking away when he called me. Dude, what the heck? You took a dog in the car? What is this? And then with horror, I saw it. In the back of the vehicle, just behind my seat, there was mud everywhere and footprints, big ones, of some animal I cannot explain. Like a big, dirty dog opened up the car door, got inside behind me, and closed it without making any noise. And then it made sense. The strange noise. All that time, it was behind me, watching, grinning. I was in shock and couldn't even speak. My colleague was confused and staring at me, and if I just turned the light on, I would have seen it, staring at me in the rearview mirror. sure last night has ruined hunting for me for good. I don't know if I'll ever feel comfortable out in the woods after last night. You see, I have no family here in central Michigan, so I figured I might as well try to bag a buck. Well, I didn't see one. Just a very creepy guy, dressed as an officer. I got out to my stand around 3 p.m. Perfect timing for me, as I like to spend around 3 hours out in the quiet backwoods. It really doesn't matter to me if I get a deer. It's just a bonus. The real treat is escaping reality for a few hours and enjoying nature's beauty. I didn't see much. A couple squirrels and a small doe, which of course I passed up. It was getting to be around 5:30 p.m. when the sun was quickly fading. I knew I had roughly 20 minutes of enough light before I knew the evening hunt would be over. Just as I was about to quietly gather my gear and get ready to leave my ground blind, a twig snapped to my left. My heart began to beat a little quicker as I envisioned an 8-pointer strolling out just before nightfall, offering me a clear shot. I slowly leaned my head forward so I could try to get a better look of the animal that was approaching. Something stopped me though. The forest was unusually quiet. The air began to fill with a very odd smell of what I could only describe as iron. I'd smelled it many times before, as I've shot plenty of deer throughout my 29 years of life. A bleat rang through the woods. Instantly I froze, and my heart was beating for a whole different reason. Fear. This was no ordinary deer bleat. It sounded like a person was trying to mimic a deer. I sat as still as a stone, as the crunching of my unwanted guest slowly walked closer and closer. It was almost pitch black now, and I was left feeling more terrified than ever. Something felt extremely off about the whole situation. Most people that called for deer used a deer call, which would have been hard to tell apart from an actual deer. This, however, sounded painfully obvious that it was someone using their own voice. It blasted through the forest again, this time maybe 10 feet away. My heart was beating uncontrollably at this point. Whoever was out here had to know I was there. It is rifle season, and it's incredibly stupid to be out here wandering in the woods, let alone trying to make yourself sound like a deer. The smell of iron was getting to be unbearable, as whatever was out here was getting closer. I decided to bring my 30-30 to my shoulder and prepare to defend myself if need be. That's when I finally saw movement through the flap of my blind. It was a tall, lanky man, wearing an officer's uniform. For a second, relief washed over me, as the feeling of not being alone was much better than being by myself in the dark woods. Then, as he took another step, I noticed how off everything was about him. His arms were too long in contrast to his short legs. Now that he was within 10 to 15 feet of me, I could see just how tall he was. He had to be close to 7 feet tall. He stopped directly in front of me and threw his head back, making that was when I got a good look at his face, and almost threw up from the amount of fear that I was feeling. His mouth didn't move as he bleated, but I could see his cheekbones moving. His mouth drooped in a sad-looking expression. Blood dripped down the corner of his mouth. He bellowed again. Seeing it a second time was when I noticed what was wrong about him. His face wasn't his. He had the skin of someone's face pulled over his head, most likely the officer's face. My heart started to beat so loud, I actually feared he would hear it. I don't know how, but he still didn't notice me, only about 15 feet away, sitting in my blind. I prayed he wouldn't. I watched in horror as he took slow, staggered steps until he walked out of view. The sound of his footsteps slowly got quieter as it walked further and further away. The smell of rot. I heard one more final bleat ring through the woods before his footsteps were all out of range together. I waited another 20 minutes before slowly exiting my blind, too afraid he would hear me and come back. I moved as quickly and as quietly as I could back to my truck. Once I was about 30 yards away from my truck, I heard the bleat again, followed by heavy footsteps. He spotted me. I took off running full blast, knowing that I had a short distance to cover. Hearing him get closer with crazy speed, I made the mistake of glancing back as I reached back to my truck and what I saw will still stick with me forever. He was running on all fours, making these huge galloping strides. He moved way faster than he should have been able to in that position. I jumped in my truck and started it with my shaky hands. Just as I started to pull away, I saw a flash and a huge banging noise as it slammed into the side of my truck. I floored it and raced out of there as fast as I could without ditching it. He gave chase for a short while, but fell behind pretty quickly. I drove the 15 minutes home in silence, just to make sure. As she spoke, I could tell she was genuinely spooked, though she kept her voice jovial. Patrick noticed too, and was quick to interject that it was probably nothing more than wildlife. Joe, however, was equally as eager to inform us that he had grown up in the area and that this forest had a reputation for missing campers. Of the campers that had been found, their bodies were always discovered beyond recognition. Some were found seemingly skewered at the top of impossibly tall trees, while others had been strung up by their feet and torn apart. All circumstances were mysterious, and while each case had an official explanation, many locals suspected the police department was covering something up, since most explanations were a stretch at best. The conversation died off pretty quickly with that information, and Mary and I returned to our campsite. She was understandably unsettled and even suggested that maybe we should leave. I reassured her the best I could, promising that if anything unusual started to happen, we would leave, and my drunken charm somehow managed to convince her, since it was only one more night anyway. Under the guise of watching the stars, I laid down blankets and pillows in the back of the truck, and we lay down together to snuggle. Naturally, things went the way I hoped, and before long, we were getting pretty heated, when we heard a soft snap from the forest. At hearing the twig break, she stopped and started to sit up. I did my very best to convince her that it was nothing, but the sounds of bushes rustling was undeniable. There was something moving toward us from the brush. At this point, I sat up and gently pushed her to the side and half behind days alone in the back country at a time. That said, my first few months in the job were everything I wanted. Plenty of time outdoors, mostly upkeep on trails in the back country, along with checking up on some old stands that the Forest Service had acquired in the 50s. The pine beetle epidemic was especially bad in my region this year, so I had a lot of time marking the mortality rate in the area, amongst other details. For the most part, I loved my job. I'm a bit of an introvert, so time alone outdoors working is perfect for me. But there have been a few moments that still make me uncomfortable to think about. A couple weeks after I started, I woke up early and drove down a pretty rough, forested section of backcountry with lots of elevation. I was trying to check on a site that some backpackers, who had just returned from a week-long trek, had reported seeing bonfires a few nights ago. They said the fires seemed to be a few hundred yards off the trail, and that it looked like there were people around the flames. An aerial team couldn't find any signs of the fires, like the backpackers were describing, so they assumed it was falsely reported. Even so, we had a serious burn ban in effect, and I was sent out to double-check and make sure. I got about 20 miles in before I found the section of trail I needed to go down covered in earth, destroyed in some sort of landslide. It must have been recent. Neither the backpackers nor the aerial team noticed it, and someone would have. I definitely couldn't drive through, but I was only 2 miles from the site, so I grabbed my pack, checked my water, and radioed to the forest station from my ATV to let them know I was hiking the rest of the way in. I probably should have waited for a crew to come out and clear the road, but we were all really concerned about the fire, and I won't lie, I was mad at the thought of backpackers being so careless. You couldn't miss the signs coming into the forest, warning about forest fires and announcing the burn ban. There was no reason to be reckless, and so I hiked out there. It was only about 10:30 a.m. when I set out. I expected it to take about 2 hours to get to the area where the fires were reported. The elevation increase was drastic, so I had to pause every so often to catch my breath. After hiking for a while, I paused for a moment and realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. This isn't that unusual. If you've ever backpacked or even gone on long hikes before, you know that it's it's easier than you think to stumble off the trail, even for someone experienced. I'm one of the newest and youngest rangers, but I've spent a lot of time outdoors backpacking and hiking, and normally would have a great sense of direction, so I wasn't too alarmed not to know exactly where I was. You get used to being lost. The thing that alarmed me was noticing a pink hue lighting up the forest. The sun was about to disappear behind the tree line that covered the mountain to the west. I didn't think I'd been hiking that long. I had gone maybe a mile and a half in an hour, or so I thought. Nonetheless, it appeared to be almost 7 p.m. now. I quickly decided the safest thing would be to head back south towards my ATV, which stored all of my overnight gear, and come back tomorrow. It would be embarrassing to explain to the other rangers that I lost track of time, but it would be worse to get stuck out here all night. Without the right equipment, I might freeze. Besides, they'd start wondering why I hadn't checked back after so long. I grabbed some loose stones off the ground and left a sign to indicate I had been there, and set off in the direction I thought I wandered off from the trail. I quickly found it, but it was a section I hadn't been through earlier. Somehow, I had found my way farther north, and funnily enough, I saw a yellow trail marker not too far up the mountain. I realized it was the marker for the next 10-mile section, the area the fire reports had mentioned. The sun was almost touching the mountain. This was a strange fire, too. It burned in an almost clean line down the mountain's ridge, forming a recognizable rhombus. And normally, forest fires around here aren't intense enough to completely take out fully grown pine trees. But this fire had been hot. Everything was scorched, total mortality. It almost seemed unnatural, but we couldn't find anything in the ashes to explain it. I wondered if I had missed something a few days after we left, but eventually, after talking to the veteran rangers, I decided it was just one of those things that can't be explained. Apparently, it's not all that uncommon from what they've said. According to them, if you spend enough time in the wilderness, you start to see things, seeing you. I didn't know what they meant by that, but we didn't have time to talk more, and I haven't seen them much since. A week after that, I found a couple of idiots trying to start a cooking fire at one of the trailheads. I yelled at them, probably harsher than I should have. They seemed to genuinely feel bad about it. Apparently, they missed all of the signs. I decided to let it go and began to leave. But before I drove out, I saw the spark and catch of a fire in the rearview mirror. Infuriated, I drove back and got out. The campers were just as confused as me. The fire pit was completely cold. It looked the same just as I had seen it, empty and unused, after making them clean out the twigs and leaves they tried to use. Confused, I walked around the entire trailhead, but didn't see any sign of a fire. I figured it was a trick of light in the rearview mirror, and left. I convinced myself over the next couple months not to worry about the wildfire stuff, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened, until a few days ago. I was on trail maintenance with another ranger, Lauren. She'd been working as a ranger for almost 10 years, so I generally followed her lead. We were about 15 miles into the back country, checking on some primitive campsites for campers. We were currently at campsite 3. There's 8 total, and they form a large U, over almost 90 miles surrounding one of the larger mountains in the region. It was getting into fall, so it was supposed to be empty while we worked our way through, checking up on site quality. All afternoon, I had been cutting out a new trail from the campsite, up to a spring that had changed course recently. The shadows were beginning to grow long, but I was close to finishing, so I kept cutting away. About a half hour later, I broke through and walked onto a boulder the ground slanted into, and watched the head of the spring just inside up the mountain. It looked like a deer path meandered its way up the spring head, so I started up. When I got there, I almost threw up. The spring flowed clearly enough, but just to the right of it, a section of the ground turned into weathered stone. In the middle, a skinned deer, with spatters and other pools of red scattered everywhere in the nearby vicinity. I've seen plenty of dead animals before, but this was messed up. Something had skinned a deer, and very cleanly, and I couldn't find any other signs of damage, but its actual hide was nowhere to be seen. Flies were starting to circle the meat. did not look like it had been there long. I quickly hiked back down the several hundred yards I cut out and found Lauren, who was back from working and making dinner. I paused to catch my breath and told her I had to show her something. She looked concerned, so we went back up to the spring. When we got there, the deer was gone, and I couldn't find a drop of anything. I had been gone maybe an hour at most. It didn't seem possible. Lauren assumed I was just messing with her, so I played it off and tried to forget about it. But I haven't forgotten about it. And apparently, Lauren told my supervisor, Jonathan. He asked me to come back to the forest station, so tomorrow I'm driving out of the back country. He sounded different though, almost like he didn't really want to call me in. I guess I'll see how this goes, and update this when I can. Part 2. I don't think I should be alive. I met with my supervisor yesterday, and at first, it seemed like it might be just a formality. He didn't say anything about the deer. We made small talk for a while, but finally, he broke the safety of our conversation by pausing and saying, "You're probably wondering why I called you back a few days early this rotation." I nodded slowly, and he continued. "Well, we've all been really impressed by your performance, and I finally got approval from HQ, so congratulations. You passed your 3-month performance review, and are now a permanent ranger with us." This caught me off guard, but I quickly masked my relief, and thanked him. We talked a bit more about the increased responsibility, and he gave me my next assignment with the team. I was feeling pretty good, shook his hand, and was on my way out. Before I shut the door behind me, he said, "Before you leave, you mentioned you saw some oddly skinned deer out there. Something scare you?" My face went pale, and I thought about telling him the truth, but I instead muttered something about it being a dumb joke. Jonathan nodded his head thoughtfully, and though he didn't look satisfied with my answer, he didn't press me. He just said, "That would be an unusual thing to find," measuring each word out carefully, while looking past me distantly. That felt like the end of our conversation, so I shut the door behind me, walking away as quickly as I could without seeming weird. Something was off, and for some reason, I got the feeling the whole meeting had been to ask me that last question. I should have driven out of the mountains and back home after that meeting, but something held me back. On the drive back into the mountains, I got caught up in the beauty of the rising slopes, twisting valleys, and graceful, swaying pine trees. My whole life, I've come to the mountains with problems and ideas I need to think over, and they somehow make everything simple. In the shadow of the mountains, I've always been able to realize how small my worries are and find content. I briefly thought about driving home, but once I got a few miles in, I was never going back. I still had to do work here, and by the time I got my assignment location, I wasn't worried at all. I had met up with the other rangers at the campsite. They'd set up near the trailhead and found that they decided to celebrate my pseudo-promotion. At first, I didn't think I was in the mood to party, but the atmosphere was so nice. I only had a few beers, and a few hours later, I was pretty drunk. I got to talking with Ryan, another ranger who had been on the job about as long as Lauren, on the tailgate of his truck, away from the rest of the team. We were overlooking the valley that ran for miles north, where we'd be working for the next few weeks. There's a lot of different types of rangers, but I've always found the quiet ones to have the best stories. Ryan was normally one of the quiet rangers, but he chose this time to open up to me. I'd been telling him about the rhombus fire from a few weeks ago, and he was nodding at different points in my story. When I mentioned I was walking off the trail and losing track of time, he looked alert. I laughed it off as a dumb mistake, but he took it seriously. I've heard of losing time like that before, but never so close to the forest station. I've always heard it happening deep in the forest, like 100+ miles out, and you weren't that far. This seemed to discern him. He took a sip of his beer. There's more too. I've heard it goes way back, to Native Americans even, but they called it wandering. They say that the people who become wanderers first wander through the woods from camp to camp, never staying anywhere overnight, preferring to keep to the caves and hollows throughout the pines. They eventually accomplish what they seek in a way, becoming a part of the wild. They adopt animalistic qualities and disappear from anger, as yet again, my hunt was ruined. I stared him down, hoping he would back up and notice me in the tree, then turn around and go back the way he came. That way, there'd be a slight chance I could still see some deer. Once he got about 20 feet away from my stand, I noticed something was off about him. His body was completely stiff, his arms glued to his side, and he stared straight forward with a stone expression on his face. His legs, however, were taking these huge, high-knee steps, like he was sort of marching or exercising. I was a little creeped out at his odd behavior, but not really scared yet. After a few seconds of watching him, I figured he was some idiot intentionally ruining my hunt. I was just about to shout out to the weirdo and ask what he was doing when a twig snapped a little ways off to my right. The guy froze, and his head snapped in the direction of where the noise came from. He stared for a few seconds, then out of nowhere, took off running, impossibly fast, to whatever had caused the twig to snap. I stared, surprised at how fast this thing was running. I kid you not, he had been running well over 30 miles per hour, as he closed 60 to 70 yards in about 4 seconds. As he got to a tree, he scaled that tree faster than a squirrel could. My heart was hammering so loud at this point, I actually feared he would hear it and come for me next. The sounds of an animal screeching as it was being torn about rang through the woods. Whatever it was, he caught it, and was, what I'm guessing, eating it alive. After a couple seconds of screeching, the woods fell completely silent, other than my frantic breathing. I closed my eyes and took 3 deep, slow breaths to settle my nerves. When I opened my eyes back up, my heart took another leap, as the guy was standing 20 feet away, looking down in the snow at something. My footprints in the snow. Oh, please no, I thought to myself. I'm not ashamed to admit I was in tears at this point. I was so afraid. I slowly reached to my side and put my hand on my pistol I always carried with me, in case it came down to it. I watched in terror as he slowly followed my footsteps. He crept along until he stood directly under my tree. Then, he slowly lifted his head up until he looked directly at me. We stared at each other for a good couple of seconds, until he put his hand on the ladder leading to my stand, getting ready to climb up. I was completely paralyzed in fear as I watched him slowly pull himself up the first step. Then, by the grace of God, I heard a voice somewhere in the distance. The creepy guy heard it too, and he hopped back down onto the ground. "Jim, I got one," I heard the guy in the distance shout to someone, probably his buddy. The guy under my stand took off running as fast as before, towards the other hunter's voice. I saw my only chance to get out of there, so I undid my harness in record time, and practically jumped out of the tree and started running back to my truck. Thankfully, I wasn't too far in, and soon made it over the small hill. I looked back to see if he was chasing me, but I was in the clear. I got to my truck and threw my bow in and jumped in, starting it and pulling away as fast as I could. With snow, I wasn't able to drive as quickly as I wanted, but after an intense 10 minutes, I was back on the main road. I don't know what that was, but I know one thing. I'm not hunting in state land ever again. Once, my uncle told me the story about how he had seen skinwalkers by a shipwreck, New Mexico. My uncle was a long-haul truck driver. He was coming back from Colorado and had pulled over by the shiprock to stretch his legs and let his dog pee. We are Navajo, so he knew better than to be walking around after sundown, but he was always mischievous and curious. His dog Moose got out and peed right away and wanted right back in the truck. No matter what my uncle did, he couldn't convince Moose to take a walk with him, even though they'd been in the truck for over 10 hours. So, my uncle takes a walk toward the actual shiprock, and it's almost sundown. He continues to climb the rock. See, his friend told him a story about a secret cave up on top, and he wanted to see if it was true. He continued to climb and circle the mountain. Soon he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He felt wrong in the pit of his stomach, but he had to see what was going on up there. Soon he began to feel a weird vibration in his feet, but before he could process what was happening, he heard chanting. He began to climb again. The higher he went, the louder the chants got. It was almost as if they were calling to him. Soon he began to see a glow on the rocks. The closer he got, the more he could see the fire dancing against the rock walls. He carefully slid up a rock, and he was shocked to see 4 men dancing in animal skins. They circled the fire, always dancing, always chanting. Soon they began to change right before my uncle's eyes. My uncle was hidden low, but unable to move. The men's legs began to change as they danced. They were throwing some sort of herb into the fire and danced round and round. My uncle watched as their hands began to turn into paws, but they still danced. Soon their faces began to morph and blur. My uncle felt a sickness take place in his chest and stomach, but what could he do now? He had to stay hidden. Their coyote faces still chanting, and their long coyote legs still danced. Soon their melodic chanting turned into howling. They danced with 2 legs. The night was dark. There was no moon, no light except the light that came from the fire. My uncle wanted to run, but he knew if he ran, it would be sure death. While he was thinking, all of a sudden the skinwalkers took off in a blink of an eye. They ran down the mountain as if it was nothing. My uncle watched as they all went in different directions. He knew this was his only chance to escape. He tore down the mountain like he had a rocket strapped to his back. He finally made it to his truck. His hair was still standing on his arms. He jumped up to open the door, and there by the handle was a giant coyote print. It was red. He dared not to touch it. He opened up the door and started up his truck and got out of there as fast as he could. He started to head towards Gallup, New Mexico. He was doing 70 down the highway, trying to get as far away as he could. When he looked out his passenger side window, he saw a giant coyote keeping pace with him. My uncle said it was almost like it smiled at him. It then ran off